I think we can start. Good morning to everyone on this side of the Atlantic. Good afternoon or good evening to those of you on the other side. My name is Natan Meir. I'm at Portland State University in Oregon, in the United States. And this panel is entitled Polish Jews Towards a New Past. The panel seeks to inquire how the availability and accessibility of archival collections has shaped the study of Polish Jewish history. Now, originally, the panel was supposed to cover much of the sweep of Polish Jewish history from the early modern period to the late 20th century. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Ofer Dines, was not able to join us. So our two presentations focus on the interwar period and the period of the Holocaust, as well as the period of Reconstruction in the post-war period. And the panelists will reflect on ideological shifts, loss and recovery of archives, and how the opening and closing of borders have informed historians and continue to do so today. So I'm very excited to be here, and I realize that I don't remember who is presenting first.
I'll be presenting first. We'll go in chronological order.
I'm going to introduce, right, that makes sense, chronological order, right? It's a historical panel. So Agnieszka Wierzcholska is currently working at the German Historical Institute in Paris on a postdoc project about the Yiddish journalist and poet David Einhorn and his transnational life from Tsarist Russia to Switzerland, Poland, Weimar era Berlin, Paris, and finally New York. That's a little bit, it reminds me of your transnational life a bit, no?
All history is autobiography, yeah.
She was employed as a researcher and teacher at the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin, where she worked on her PhD. And this paper is based on that PhD dissertation, which focused on interactions between Jews and non-Jews in Tarnów. It will be published next year with Brill Schöning under the title Nur Erinnerungen und Steine sind geblieben, Leben und Sterben einer polnisch-jüdischen Stadt Tarnów 1918 bis 1945. Dr. Wierzcholska.
Thank you very much, Natan, for this kind introduction. I just have a question to you. Do you hear me? Because my screen is frozen and I actually don't really see anything except a frozen picture. But you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Oh, we hear you, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yes, I'm going to present parts of my PhD project, the microhistory of Tarnów. And actually, I want to argue in the paper that microhistory of Polish-Jewish interactions in the urban space can give us new insights on Polish-Jewish relation in general. As you all know, Jews, the majority of Jews in the Second Polish Republic lived in towns, whereas the grand majority of the non-Jewish population lived in rural areas. So towns are basically a dense realm of interactions, of a space where entanglement happens, where you have a lot of interface. And what I wanted to look at in this project on Tarnów was not so much a local history of one town where I could sort of cover a vast history of the town itself, but more to use this microhistorical approach and the microhistorical tools to zoom into, as much as I can, these chosen realms of interaction where Jews and non-Jews would interact together. So you can say that microhistory is small in the scale, and therefore it shifts our sight to new sources in a way, or to see sources in a different light. But the question it generates are overarching, and the scope it investigates in is larger than the town itself. Because individuals or small groups of people, such as I have analyzed, are never self-contained, autonomous entities, but they act, react, they live in a very specific historical, socio-political, cultural setting. And actually, if you want to really explain the actions and the perceptions of these small groups or individuals, you have to sort of explain the relevant world around them to really understand what is how they acted. So in this paper, I want to argue that the close reading of new sources from the realms of interaction in urban spaces give us new insights into Polish-Jewish history. So let me just say a few words about the town itself, about Tarnów. It's a mid-sized town of about 50,000 inhabitants before the Second World War, half of which were Jewish and the other half were Roman Catholic Poles in their grand majority. Or this is the other half. The city is located around 80 kilometers east of Krakow, and it was an industrial town with very well organized workers' organizations, but also strata of well-to-do bourgeoisie and intelligentsia. I want to give you 3 examples of realms of interactions that I analyzed in my PhD. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a glimpse on the way I worked with the tools of microhistory and the sources I used. So the 3 examples will be first on the city council during the time of the Second Polish Republic, then on public elementary schools, and my third point would be apartment houses during the German occupation. So my first point, the city councils. City councils are, of course, a very important field of interaction between Jewish inhabitants of a town and their non-Jewish neighbors. It's an important field of political activity, especially that Jews lived mostly in towns. And it's a field where power was negotiated, financial resources were negotiated, subsidies for institutions were negotiated. And so I looked very closely at the minutes of the city council meetings. And the composition of city councils was, of course, very different from state institutions, such as, for example, the parliament, because the social makeup, ethnic makeup, religious makeup of the towns was very different than on the national scale. So majorities on the national scale could be minorities in some towns and vice versa. And this, of course, shaped the political programs, the political alliances, as well as the election campaigns. In Tarnów, of course, half of the electorate was Jewish, and this had a massive effect on the way that election campaigns were led and that political alliances were fathomed. So city councils are a very important field of interaction between Jews and non-Jews. Of course, studies have been done on city council. Just want to mention the book that came out this year by Hanna Kozińska-Witt about the city council of Poznań, Kraków, and Warsaw. So what are my key findings from my investigations into Tarnów? First of all, that oftentimes the local political groups or the way politics formed or local political groups were formed was not always determined by ethnic categories. Political or economic cleavages within the local society were much more salient than ethnic categories in the way that political alliances were formed. For example, the Sanacja camp in Tarnów was composed of non-Jewish Poles as well as Jews, and their socialist opposition was also composed of Jews and non-Jews organized in the PPS and the Bund. So the question I asked myself when analyzing the minutes of the city council was actually to find out when, by whom, and why ethnicity was mobilized as a political factor. In other words, when did it become important that a certain deputy was Jewish? When did his being Jewish became a political argument and was on the political agenda? And this required a very close reading of the city council minutes, but also of local press, pamphlets for election campaigns, and the reactions of the local population. A major shift took place in the late 1930s after Piłsudski's death in 1935, when anti-Semitism became sort of as the Tarnowian calls it, salonfähig. For example, the Jewish deputy mayor had to resign in 1936 from office in Tarnów. However, this dismissal of the Jewish deputy mayor had very paradox effects. Jewish deputies from the pro-government camp in the city council left this pro-government camp in protest against the dismissal of the Jewish deputy mayor and formed their own Jewish club within the city council. This meant that the pro-government camp lost its majority in the city council. The Jewish club then became a sort of, it tipped the scale between the votes of the socialist opposition and the votes of the remnants of the pro-governmental club. This in turn meant that the pro-government club sort of courted the Jewish club. It had a deal with them as to Jewish candidates for post, subsidies for Jewish institution. So there was a giving and taking, and the Jewish topic and Jewish interests all of a sudden became an agenda in the city council debates. And often the pro-government camp would vote for mentions of the Jewish club in order to have, with other votes, gain the votes of the Jewish club for their majority. So in a way, this was paradox, because if you look at the overall Polish situation in Poland, in the city council of Tarnów, Jewish interests were much better represented in the late 1930s than before 1935. In 1939, the PPS and the Bund won the election for the city councils. And we know that the Bund emerged as the strongest Jewish party in many other cities as well. And also the PPS had many successes in the 39 city council elections. So the question emerges whether in multi-ethnic cities there were political alternatives to the Ozon government that were forming themselves, so to speak, under the radar of an Ozon-led state. And these political alternatives were even capable of winning majorities in these multi-ethnic cities. And in Tarnów, there was a vote turnout of 80%. So this was really sort of representative for what the city population voted for. And these insights about cities as political alternatives could shift our picture of the Second Republic. This is one example from Tarnów, but we could look at other cities in order to sort of reinforce this hypothesis. My second points are public schools. Public schools were, of course, a very important realm of interaction between Jewish and non-Jewish children. We know that about 80% of Jewish children attended public schools. A lot has been written about public schools, sort of agents of acculturation, maybe even sort of forced acculturation of Jewish children. And we can see that on the one hand, we have research done on the topic, or literature on the topic from the sort of top-down view from the side of the government and governmental policies and circulars of the ministry. And on the other hand, we have research that is based on ego documents from Jewish children. And Kamil Kijek, who was with me on the panel, wrote an excellent book about perceptions through ego documents of Jewish youth, as you probably all know. What I want to suggest is also to include the minutes of school conferences, which I have analyzed for Tarnów, which can be found in local archives. Of course, this is a very specific perspective. It's the perspective of the teachers that look at the students. It's the perspective of, and they report about what happens in class. So there are a lot of limitations to this source, but I believe that it also gives us a lot of insights if we cross-read it with other sources. So what was interesting for me, or the question that I put in the focus, was to analyze a sort of tension that the teachers had to face. On the one hand, schools were part and parcel, or sort of transmission belt of a nationalizing state in the sense that Roger Brubaker has put it. But on the other hand, the teachers were confronted with a classroom of, say, for example, in Tarnów, 60 students, of which, for example, 40 were Jewish. So there was this multi-ethnic reality in the classroom, and at the same time, the teachers or the school and the teachers as their agents were transmission belt of the nationalizing state. So I wanted to see how the teachers coped and talked about this role and about their Jewish students. I analyzed 2 elementary schools in Tarnów. Both were within a working class district, a very poor district, and in both schools, half of the students were Jewish. So what are the main findings? I found that the language of the minutes of the teachers' conferences was remarkable. In the official language, nobody spoke of Jews and Poles, rather of Jewish and Catholic students. So the main difference that was made between the students was the religious difference in the language, in the official language. Thus, formally, all students were recognized as Poles in the civic sense, and civic education played an important role in the minutes of the teachers' conferences. Civic education, that means education, wychowanie obywatelsko-państwowe, was emphasized more in the protocols than necessarily the national education. However, the reality differed a lot from the language of the protocols. But actually, you can also read in the protocol, sort of between the lines, you can also find out something about this reality in the classroom. In one of the schools, in the Czacki Elementary School, teachers had an extremely negative view on their Jewish students. Basically, I couldn't find, I analyzed the protocols from 1925 until 1939, not one positive remark about Jewish students. They were all very negative remarks. It was underlined many times that Jewish students were late, were lazy, were dirty, didn't behave well, had a bad influence on the Catholic students, etc. And Jewish students were left alone to deal with the challenges of a multi-ethnic reality within the school. And what I mean by that is, for example, many of these students came from Yiddish-speaking homes, and Polish was not their mother tongue. And sometimes they didn't speak Polish very well when they first attended school. However, this is a problem or a phenomenon with in many schools in the Second Polish Republic, especially in cities. But this sort of problem or challenge was reinterpreted or interpreted by the teachers, and you can see that very clearly as sort of the inability of the Jewish students. So the teachers openly said and stated that the Jewish children were too lazy or unwilling or not intelligent enough to learn Polish. So you sort of see this very clear, on the one hand, you have this language who underlines this civic sense of Polishness. On the other hand, you have a very strong perception of sort of the titular nations to which the teachers belonged and the others, the Jews. However, a lot of things depended on the personality of the principal that led the school. Because in the other school that I analyzed, also an elementary school, the principal was very much engaged into helping children. He, as I said, these were poor children. Often they came to class barefoot. They came to school barefoot. They didn't have enough to eat. They had to earn money in the afternoons, etc. So the school helped a lot with free lunches, with shoes for the children, but also bought extra books for learning Polish, and employed extra teachers for sort of invested in the Jewish students, so they could follow the education in a better way. This principal of the school I'm talking about had to leave the school, however, in 1935, and then a very anti-Semitic teacher came to the school, and we can see a grand shift with this change of principals. In 1935, this school introduced ghetto benches, so Jewish students and non-Jewish students had to sit separated in an elementary school, I have to add. However, the minutes of the teachers' conferences do not mention these ghetto benches. We know that from cross-reading other sources, so here you can also see the limitations of the source. My last point is apartment houses during German occupation. So the study on Tarnów, or these microcosms of Tarnów's realms of interaction, goes beyond this era of 1939. But the realms of interactions were very much different. There was no city council anymore, and there was no, the Jewish students could not attend school. So I looked at new realms of interaction, such as workplaces where Jews were led to from the ghetto and worked with non-Jewish inhabitants of Tarnów. The ghetto fence as a sort of zone of interaction, a very asymmetrical zone of interaction, of course, and apartment houses. And I would just want to give a glimpse into this microcosm of apartment houses, because I think the story that can be told through this microhistory of apartment houses during German occupation gives us a very complex view on the social processes in the everyday life under occupation. I try to reconstruct how Jews were hiding themselves, or were hidden by others in apartment houses, either on the so-called Aryan papers or without as sort of invisible tenants. The stories tell us a lot about everyday life and about the broad scope of behavior of the non-Jewish neighbors, from extortion, denunciation, robbing, to sexual violence, and even murder. The sources I used for these apartment houses were testimonies and oral history interviews, memoirs of Jewish survivors, but also files from the Polish criminal police. And those investigations still linger in the local archives in Poland, and I find them an abundant source for investigating into so-called Polish-Jewish relations under German occupation. I also use the August Decree files from the Institute for National Remembrance, Yad Vashem archives on the righteous among nations. So what I found by looking at this microcosm of the apartment houses is that rarely there was people had just one static role throughout the occupation. The notion or the image of an altruistic righteous on the one hand and the anti-Semitic denouncer are, of course, two poles that are on two different sides, but there's many shades of gray in between, and I wanted to look at these situations. The non-Jewish population was nolens volens, implied in a field of forces created by the German project of the Shoah. And I define field of forces in the way that Alf Lütke and Tatjana Tünsmeier did, as a space, a field of different actors in very asymmetrical power relations, but these actors interact with each other. Power relations are enforced, but also questioned in these field of forces. And the local population acted, reacted, and basically lived in this field of forces. The term bystander or witness, therefore, do not reflect the reality of the Shoah. And many historians who worked on these microhistories of the Shoah question these terms, because these terms insinuate that there is something like an outside or an imaginary elsewhere. But when we're looking closely at everyday life under occupation, at, for example, apartment houses, the various degrees of implication of the non-Jewish population become evident. And helping, too, this is what I also looked at when looking at the apartment houses. Helping was a dynamic process, under constantly changing conditions. The agency of Jews cannot be underestimated in this process. Jews were very active and engaged in their endeavor to find rescue, to find help, and to rescue themselves and their families. And to describe this process of helping densely with Jews as important initiative actors in this process was one of the goals when I invested in the apartment houses. So I hope that I have shown that microhistory means that the scale of analysis is small, and therefore it shifts our attention to a new kind of sources. But the questions we hope to answer with this microhistorical approach are overarching, and I hope that the findings from the microhistorical perspective on Tarnów go beyond the individual case and stimulate new thoughts and perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for that very suggestive paper. We will collect the questions for the question period, which will come afterwards, after Kamil's paper. So our second presenter is Kamil Kijek, who is assistant professor at the Jewish Studies Department at the University of Wrocław. He has been a Prince Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Jewish History in New York, and a Soslan Family Fellow at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has held various fellowships in Israel, Germany, and the UK, and his research interests include Central East European Jewish history at the late 19th and in the 20th centuries, and social and cultural theory. He is the author of Dzieci modernizmu, świadomość I socjalizacja polityczna młodzieży żydowskiej w Polsce międzywojennej, Children of Modernism, Socialization and Political Consciousness of the Jewish Youth in Interwar Poland. Hopefully I didn't butcher the Polish too badly. Kamil.
Thank you all for joining in, and I will excuse myself for a second just to share screen and to share with my presentation that will join my that will accompany my paper. Just I'll be very grateful for a confirmation that you see the presentation. Do you see it?
I can see it.
Yes, sorry. Hello.
Yes, we can see.
Thank you. Thanks, because now I don't hear you. Okay. Thank you very much. The title of my paper is The Transnational and Archival Turn, Rethinking Post-1945 Polish Jewish History. From 1989, since the fall of the communism in East Central Europe, there was a tremendous development in the historiography of Polish Jews after the Holocaust. Not surprisingly, and from obvious reasons, it was defined by the paradigm of the Holocaust aftermath. Maybe the biggest number of its works had concentrated on demographical, psychological, and material consequences of the Second World War, post-war anti-Semitism, and anti-Jewish violence. Consequently, and in close relation to this, other histories of Polish Jewry after the Holocaust were dominated by such topics as Bricha and emigration of Polish Jews, narrow political institutional history of Polish Jewish community under communism, history of official state-sanctioned Yiddish culture, assimilation, psychological dealing with Holocaust trauma of survivors, their children and grandchildren. Finally, on post-1950, state anti-Semitism, and two last great waves of Jewish emigration from Poland in the years 1956 to 1957, and following the March anti-Semitic campaign, anti-Semitic purge of 1968. Although there are some exceptions in this vast corpus of academic literature, and I see that Anna Cichopek is among the audience, and most of this literature, despite these exceptions, is characterized by the kind of teleology of demise of Polish Jewish community after 1945. In this narrative, Holocaust with its aftermath became an encompassing foundational moment. Subsequent demise of Polish Jewish community, decreasing number of its members, the composition of its institutions, lachrymose vision of victimhood, lack of subjectivity, omnipresent power of communist state, and so-called red assimilation are deeply inscribed in this narrative. Contrary to the historiographies of previous periods, especially that of interwar and long 19th century, example of what we could hear in an interwar period, example of what we could hear in talk of Agnieszka, and I would also add the early modern histories. Another example, this kind of vision of post-1945 Polish Jewish history was not changed, contrary to these other periods, by the revolution of 1989 and opening of Eastern European archives for Western scholars and Western archives for Eastern European ones. Western scholars, with exception of these working on post-war anti-Jewish violence, are still working mainly in American, Israeli, and British archives, concentrating on Bricha and evacuation of Polish Jews by the Zionist movement. Polish historians, almost with no exception, there are some exceptions, are omitting tens of archives of various Zionist parties, youth movements, and organizations evacuated to Israel with the liquidation of the movement in Poland in 1950. Working almost solely on the official documents produced by the state-recognized Polish Jewish committees and Jewish Social Cultural Association, SKZ. Exceptions should be made here for two works, that of David Engel and Natalia Aleksiun, which had really used the opportunities of post-1989 and reached out to various archives, both from US, Great Britain, Israel, and from Poland. Nevertheless, what is symptomatic, these works are also devoted to early post-war Zionism and its emigration efforts. All of this state of historiography provides important knowledge and is a substantial scholarly achievement. Goal of my paper is not to deny it, but in the line with the purpose of this conference, to transcend it and show what else could be done in historiography of Polish Holocaust, Polish Jewry. What I want to show is that it can be written outside of the above-mentioned teleological lachrymose and subjective paradigm, the same as it was done in the last 2 decades in historiography of DP camps and Jewish community in Germany, and regarding the Jews in Soviet Union. It can be done very easily through simplest of methods, by using various sources created by the state-sanctioned institution of Polish Jewry, and this created by JDC, Zionists, and different American Jewish organizations, and personalities outside of Polish communist state control. And finally, by inviting these sources to speak one to another. Not only in the first months after the war, but especially in the years 1946-1947, Poland was visited by hundreds of Jewish activists, journalists, social care workers from all around the world of different political allegiances and worldviews. What appears in writings of people like Yakov Pat, Joseph Tenenbaum, Shmuel Leo Wohl, Shmuel Leib Schneiderman, Moshe Schulstein, Chaim Shoshkes, and many others is definitely not the clear vision of Holocaust aftermath as definite end of existence of national Jewish community in Poland. And you can see some quotations that I don't have time to read. To the contrary, they saw it with ambivalence, or even in political conditions of 1946 and 1947, and especially regarding the new Polish Western territories, expressed firm belief in its future. They have observed, for example, shtetl-like social spaces that had prevented Soviet-style atomization of Polish Jews. They have seen possibilities of Polish Jewish third way between poverty and discrimination of interwar period and the red assimilation of the new one. They have seen daily usage of Yiddish, pluralistic culture, far from being dominated by the communists, deep connection of Polish Jewish community with new American and Palestine Eretz Israel centers of Jewish world. The very same image emerges from the analysis of the leading American and British dailies writing about Poland, as well as in the American Yiddish press of 1947. Just to use one example of many examples, in February 1947, an article published under two different titles in the New York Herald Tribune and in the Washington Post, the war correspondent Margaret Higgins, reporting on her impressions from Lower Silesia, wrote, I quote, "The controversy over how Jews fare in the New Poland seems to have a clear answer here. Most of the 50,000 Jews in Lower Silesia say the opportunities are so great that they will remain permanently in Poland, giving up thoughts of emigrating to Palestine." Like the authors of the travelogues, she too highlights the sociological revolution taking place in Western Poland, in which, unlike before the war, Jews had unrestricted access to employment in industry, government, and all other occupations and professions. The conclusions of some of other articles about the Jews in Poland, and Lower Silesia in particular, which were published at this time in the Christian Science Monitor, the Manchester Guardian, the New Statesman and the Nation, the Jewish Advocate, the Boston Daily Globe, the New York Times, and finally in Yiddish forwards were similar. What emerges from this transnational analysis of transnational sources regarding the transnational discussion on the future of Polish Jewry that took place in the years 1946 and 1947 is the simple fact that it was the Stalinism of the years 1949-1956 and not the Kielce pogrom and anti-Semitism of the first post-war years that ended the belief in possibilities of reconstruction of national Jewish community in Poland. This non-teleological and transnational attitude gives also another perspective for research on Polish Zionism in the years 1945-1950. It allows us to study it not only as venue of Bricha, that is, organized flight of Jews from Poland in the years 1945-1946, but also later, in the years 1947 and 1949, as the form of daily political activity and culture of daily life, autonomous in creating its own politics of memory, cultural symbols, identities, performed daily in kibbutzim, Hebrew schools, youth camps, cells of various Zionist parties and youth organizations. What emerges from cautious and critical research of Zionist activity in post-1945 Poland is the fact that the peak of its organizational and cultural development was not during the big wave of Bricha in the years 1945-1946, but in the years 1947-1949, with development of Hebrew schooling, long-term Hachsharot, party cells and youth organization Snifim, and firm conviction of card-carrying activists, and such famous figures as Chaika Grossman, Yitzhak Tabenkin, Meir Yari, or Yitzhak Greenbaum, that yes, we want to take out from Poland all of its Jews, but that at the same time, tens of thousands of them will stay, and the Zionist movement should have a long-term plan of building the Zionist diaspora culture among them, as long as it will be allowed by the Polish and Jewish communists. Again, nobody knew if, when, and how Stalinism of the years 1949-1956 will be introduced. The same Zionist leaders and activists who after 1950 spoke in the language of post-Holocaust teleology and lack of future of Polish Jewry, in the years 1946, 1947, and even 1948, were much less certain how the things will develop. Similar non-teleological and until today almost unresearched story is the history of Jewish Orthodoxy in post-1945 Poland. If we go beyond sources produced under communist supervision by official Polish Jewish institutions that marginalize the place of Orthodoxy and go to American, British, and Israeli archives, to reports of rabbis, representatives of Agudat Israel visiting Poland, very different picture emerges. Picture in which in Lower Silesia, place with the largest number of Jews repatriated from the Soviet Union, and in Łódź, city with the largest Jewish community, religious congregations supported by international Orthodox organizations were none less successful in organizing Jews, providing them with shelter, food, clothes, and work. Thus, transnational perspective and transnational inclusion of various archival sources stored today outside Poland and created outside the official state-controlled censorship shows us much larger strength and agency of non-communist Jews and their institutions that it was acknowledged before. The same image emerges from the analysis of transnational contacts of Polish Jews after the Holocaust. Their contacts with family members, activities of foreign and transnational Jewish organizations, finally, financial help granted to Polish Jewish community, active presence in Poland of hundreds of envoys from the West, or activities of American Polish Jewish Landsmannschaft. Finally, widening and normalization of our research and understanding of post-1945 Polish Jewish history can be brought by introduction of some of the solutions present in the last decades in the Holocaust research. I mean here concentration on the problems of family, issues of gender and of women experience, individual perspective of the victims of the Holocaust. The same perspective introduced to the post-1945 Polish Jewish studies can bring much richer story than the experience of anti-Semitism, communist oppression, and unavoidable emigration. Of course, I'm not denying the importance of 1944-1946 wave of anti-Jewish violence, Stalinism, popular anti-Semitism of 1956 thaw, and finally that of 1968. At the end of the day, most of the people I'm talking about were victims of these events and emigrated, at least to some extent because of them. Nevertheless, the years 1945, 1968, somewhat similar to the years 1917 and 1939 in Soviet Union, were the years of social and educational revolution among Polish Jews. Thousands of children of shoemakers, tailors, and petty merchants, graduates of Inter Chedarim and few classes of primary schools, now attended high schools, universities, higher medical and technical schools. These were years of professionalization of Polish Jews, where many became not only lawyers or doctors, but also mathematicians, engineers, and so on. These were the years of migration to big Polish cities. Overall, this kind of modernization and rapid social advance of the children was the main reason why many of their parents decided not to emigrate from Poland, first in 1946, then in 1949-1950, and some even not in 1956. Evolution of dominant forms of Jewish identity and self-identification concentrated connected to these social facts cannot be described and explained in somewhat exotizing and orientalizing term of so-called red assimilation. All real difference notwithstanding, post-1945 Jewish experience under communism cannot be simply juxtaposed as exotic, paradigmatically different from the one of the Jewish West. I don't have time to dwell on that, but let me just pose a question that I hope will be answered by the future scholars. To what extent the social revolution of Polish Jews in the years 1945-1968 can be described beyond the lachrymose and exotizing red assimilation paradigm by categories used to describe Western Jewish experience of the time, such as secularization, modernization, metropolization, professionalization, finally, evolution from nationhood to peoplehood. What is the cause of this state of affairs and of this kind of large white spot in the historiography of the Polish Jews after 1945? What is the reason of obvious story lying out there in the archival sources, accessible and available, and yet still unwritten? Some of reasons are obvious. First of all, it's Holocaust itself. Second, communism, Cold War, and the fact that communists and at the same time nationalist Poland had in fact pushed out most of its remaining Jews. Their own biographical narrations, as all the other made by people telling their life stories, had to have some teleology, and there was the one of demise of Jewish life in Poland and their individual redemption after emigration in Israel, United States, Scandinavia, or other places of the West. But there are also other reasons. One is the solipsism of Polish historical discourse, its peculiar ethnocentrism, even of its left liberal side. Until this very day, Polish historical discourse is unable to grasp richness, autonomy, and subjectivity of Jewish history as part of history of Poland. Instead, as far as Jewish matters are concerned, especially regarding the Second World War and post-war history, focusing on so-called Polish-Jewish relations, on questions whether Poles were good or bad for the Jews, on what does this tell us about the Poles and Poland, much less being interested in Jews and richness of their history in Poland itself. Another reason, of course, stems from Israeli Zionist and American Jewish historical discourses, building up their self-narrations of their undoubtful 20th century success through image of history of Jews in communist Eastern Europe indicated above. Nevertheless, now we live in much less bipolar and much more pluralistic world that welcomes us to write another post-war history of Jews in Poland. In this new history, transnational story is reflected in the transnationalism of its sources, located today in different parts of the world, created for various reasons from often opposite ideological perspectives. This creates a great opportunity for the historian to make them to speak to one another, provide him with different pluralistic visions of the same story. Story in which Zionist teleologies can be critical towards communist ones and vice versa. Story in which there will be place for religious and other so far neglected aspects of Jewish life under communism. Story in which family, gender, and individual histories will find their places, with their protagonists being de-exotified and living normal lives. History of which historians will be conscious and critical regarding the grand narratives and major discourses. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamil. Another excellent paper, gives us tremendous food for thought. So what's going to happen now is I will offer some reflections on the two papers, and then we will move to the questions. We have about 45 minutes, so what I'd like to suggest is that I will offer thoughts and questions, then Kamil and Agnieszka can respond if they wish, and then we'll take the questions that have been appearing in the chat. The theme that unites the excellent papers today is, at least on the face of it, the impact of the archives on the study of Polish Jewish history. Agnieszka and Kamil ask us to look at the history of Polish Jews through new lenses, arguing that archival documents can add new dimensions to an aspect of the historical experience that we thought we had understood, and essentially arguing that reading new kinds of archival documents and reading them in a new light can open up new worlds for us, as it were. Agnieszka uses microhistory to reconstruct social, political, and educational networks and relationships at the local level, the example of Tarnów. And her account here, which is of course just a narrow window into her full monograph-length study, seeks to complicate the existing narrative of Polish-Jewish relations in the interwar period and during the Holocaust. She finds that political decisions were not always determined by national or ethnic identity. Specifically, her investigation of the long relationship and indeed the alliance between the Bund and the PPS in Tarnów reveals that they worked closely together in the opposition on the city council starting in the early 1930s when they jointly founded a socialist club. Even more surprising is what happened in the election of 1939. The two parties won a majority of the seats on the city council after having campaigned on separate lists, but promising to govern collaboratively if elected. Their opponents were all nationalist parties, either ethnically Polish or Jewish, mostly Zionists. I think this is a different landscape of Polish-Jewish relations than the one we're used to seeing. And I think that's partly what you're arguing in your paper. And while Agnieszka makes clear that there were very specific conditions in Tarnów that made this kind of cooperation possible, even as it could hardly be imagined in many other places in the Second Republic, I would like to hear more about how this particular microhistory can help us better understand the macro level of Polish-Jewish relations in this period. And I'm also interested in whether microhistory can help us see sources in a different way. Because I think one of the things you're arguing is that your particular approach does help you see archival sources in a new light. And I would just like to hear a little bit more about that. Agnieszka's claim that, quote, local political groups were not always determined by ethnic categories, end quote, seems to hold true for the PPS and the Bund to some extent. But overall, I think your study shows that politics usually was ethnically based. And I imagine you would agree with me there. In the end, there was still a Bund, and that made it clear that local Jewish socialists felt the need for a specifically Jewish party. And when the Jewish counselors in the Sanacja camp split off to form their own Jewish club, you showed that the Sanacja had to curry favor with them in order to continue to keep their votes. So it's true in a way that this allowed Jewish issues to make it onto the city council's docket, which is obviously important, but it's also true that ethnic categories held firm. The anti-Semitic act that started all of that, the dismissal of the Jewish deputy mayor, prompted the Jewish counselors to reject a continued collaborative agreement with the Sanacja camp, which presumably now consisted only of ethnic Poles. So moving on to the question of public schools, which is really fascinating to me. There's a striking divide between the formal and seemingly what we would call politically correct language of the protocols of the schools conference and the deprecating comments about Jews made by some teachers when they were, I guess, off the record. And I'm curious, what was it in the context of the schools conference, do you think, that compelled teachers to speak of civic education, as you mentioned, that was accessible to all Polish citizens, regardless of religion? Were they trying to impress the principals, who were apparently, as you said, progressive pedagogues? Was there some larger pressure that they sensed not to express open anti-Semitism in an official forum? I sense that we may need to read between the lines of the archival document to get a sense, and you're probably already doing this, of motivation, of the ambiance of the conference, of the tone and the nuance. And as you've told us before, the microhistory complicates the picture, and especially our understanding of the contradictions within human behavior. The same teacher who spoke politely and even with conviction of providing all pupils with the same civic education might later, in the classroom, privilege ethnically Polish children over Jewish ones who seemed less, quote unquote, deserving or hardworking, and maybe did not see any contradiction, of course, in his or her own behavior. And that kind of human complexity is even more starkly visible in your study of Polish-Jewish relations in Tarnów during World War II. I've switched now to the second person. I hope that's okay. I'm talking to you directly, Agnieszka. You highlight the instability of the categories of bystander and witness, of rescuer and denouncer. I think we all accept this as a very important development in our understanding of the dynamics of Christian-Jewish relations overall in the Holocaust. An ethnic Pole who chose to help Jews might have a range of complex motivations for doing so, from the venal to the altruistic. But of course, this kind of history is harder to relate than the standard master narrative, and therefore less likely to be accepted in place of those narratives by politicians or journalists or the general public. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how this kind of complicated historical narrative can be transmitted to the non-scholarly public. Is it even possible in today's political climate, especially in Poland, where historians writing nuanced narratives are as likely or more likely to find themselves in court at the wrong end of a libel suit as on TV or radio trying to explain their complicated historical conclusions. And I also wonder, to some extent, this is a question for both of you. To what extent is it the archives that are the key in unlocking this kind of complex and nuanced history? You know, when I began my first research project on Kiev, I was a graduate student, so I was very naive, obviously, but I was sure that the archives would unlock all of the secrets. And they did unlock some, but I've kind of moved away from being so archivally based, and I'm wondering if there's something special about the archive as opposed to other kinds of sources, which I know that both of you employ, because both of your papers are and your other works are very, very skillful at drawing upon all different kinds of sources. Now, Kamil's paper encourages us to push back against the quote-unquote teleology of demise that has governed the scholarship on Polish Jewry after 1945. According to this narrative, the Jewish community in Poland was doomed from the very beginning, meaning in the post-war period, because of circumstances that are all known very well to us now, but that were not known or even in existence at that point, right? In 1946 or in 1947. He argues that to transcend the lachrymose version of post-war Polish Jewish history, we must use all of the archival sources at our disposal, both those generated inside Poland and those created by Jewish organizations in the West and in Israel, and, quote, to invite those sources to speak one to another, end quote. I like that phrase very much. If you read, if one reads your article on the attempt to create Jewish settlements in the quote-unquote newly reclaimed region of Lower Silesia in the immediate post-war years, you understand, and we understood actually from what you told us today, that there's much more to that period than just the Kielce pogrom and the Bricha initiative. And yet, you yourself acknowledge that the Silesian Jewish project contained within itself the seeds of its own demise, because it was predicated upon the integral Polish nationalism that accompanied the expulsion of the local Germans and the Polonization of the region. That Polish nationalism would ultimately, I think you're arguing, have to follow its own inexorable logic and put an end to the vibrant Jewish life that had begun to take root there. Now, isn't there a certain teleology built into that narrative as well? In other words, if it had not been for Stalinist policies imposed from Moscow, is it possible that the Polonization of Lower Silesia would not necessarily have led to the erasure of a distinct Jewish identity in the region? It is certainly true that using as broad an array of sources as you do in your paper reveals aspects of post-war Jewish life that are very different from the customary narrative. For example, you argue that the apex of Zionist activity in post-war Poland was in 1947 to 1949, with the very rich complex of educational, political, and youth activity, which is, well, at least to me, a revelation. I think the most important message here, however, is the call to normalize the post-war Polish Jewish experience, what you call de-exoticizing, and to discuss it and analyze it using the same categories that we would use for any other modern Jewish community. Now, I think for many people, the idea of a vibrant Polish Jewry after the Holocaust is essentially absurd. But you're saying there was vibrancy, and you proved that. There was cultural dynamism immediately after the war, and what we might call sociological vibrancy, and certainly movement, professionalization, urbanization, etc. And this is a narrative that attempts to abandon tendentious political arguments about Polish-Jewish relations, about the doomed nature of Jewish life under communism, about the triumph of Zionism. And you're arguing, I think, that it's only when we look at a multiplicity of sources across borders and institutions that we can abandon the subjectivity that inheres in those sources and gain a much more nuanced understanding of our topic. Now, the last thing I'll say is we're directed at both of you. And I think what seems to be going on here in your papers is a larger question of contingency and teleology. And we have this big question in both of the papers. What if? Agnieszka asks if there could have been a different way. I think this is what you're asking. Because after all, in 1939, there was a PPS Bund majority on the Tarnów City Council. But of course, it never got to govern because this was in the summer of 1939. And I think one of your larger questions is, does the Tarnów example give us an kind of alternative reality to what might have happened? Or an alternative to what did happen, of course, is what I mean to say. And for Kamil, I think the question is, what if Stalinism hadn't intervened? So there's this question about, the contingency and the what ifs. And the other question I have is are those questions related to the archival turn? Is there something about looking at archives in a new way that that allows us to ask those questions? And obviously, there's also, I think, a connection to periodization and to approaching the traditional periodization in a new way, which both of you do. Both of you challenge that traditional periodization. So I think I've spoken enough. I'm going to stop there and allow the panelists to respond. And I'm also collecting questions so that we can have the question period as well. I guess if both of you, if you could each try to limit your initial responses to, I guess, maybe 3 minutes or so, and then we'll have enough, because we have a lot of questions in the chat as well. Let's see. Agnieszka, do you want to go first?
Do you hear me when I speak?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I have some technical problems, but I heard everything that you said, Nathan, and I'm very grateful for your comments. And it's been a lot of food for thought, and to limit it in 3 minutes, I don't think that I can answer extensively on everything that you said, but I keep it in mind.
What you want to answer.
Yes, so I'll just start with the first questions on the city council, and I saw also the question, one of the questions from Natalia about the Galician background of Tarnów, which sort of fits to the answer. So. So my claim is not that ethnicity doesn't play a role at all. This is not my claim, that ethnic categories are sort of in a vacuum and they don't play a role, and political and economic cleavages or alliances are much more powerful than ethnic ones. I'm just asking when to give weight to which sort of categories and how the actors played it out. And this is important because there is the Galician background is extremely important because Jews were in the city council from the 1870s in the Galician city council. So there has been a long tradition of Jewish participation in local politics, although it has been for a long time among the elite of the town, the bourgeois elite of the town. And so what became important for those who wanted to participate and be part of local decision making, where people who were outside of this bourgeoisie don't. So the working class, the PPS and the Bund, who had to organize themselves in order to have access to to the city council, which was very hard because for a long time the Galician voting system based on property was in that was the election order. So that was basically a three-class vote and not a democratic vote, and therefore this also shaped local politics. But what I wanted to show in the paper is, and this is also answering sort of the question between micro and macro history, or macro level and micro level, is how this shift between political fights, socio-political fights, social class, how the ethnic category played into it, and when did it become more and more salient, more and more important. And you can see that it was very much linked to the overall politics on the state level and on the voivodeship level. So these city councils, although they had the social makeup of the town was very different than the state level, were very much linked to state politics. And so this is showing how ethnicity was becoming more and more a political category within the city council. So not to say that it disappeared, but that there is a question how it played out. When was it mobilized, and for what purposes and for what reasons, and when was it opportunistic to play the card of the ethnic categories? Just to give you an example, there was the Endecja in Tarnów was established very late in the late 1930s, and then but the person who was locally responsible for the Endecja in 1933, he had an election campaign for all citizens, Jews and non-Jews together, because he was extremely in a very opportunistic person, and he wanted to get into the city council. He lobbied around different groups, and you see that he thought that playing the card of anti-Semitism was only something that would catch votes in the late 1930s in Tarnów and not 1933. And the second thing that I want to, three things that I want to say. The second thing, you asked about bystander witness, and that it's so complex and that it doesn't translate so well to the non-scholarly public. And if I have a solution how to translate it, if I would, it would be wonderful. But of course, I don't. Yet I think that it's very important. If doing microhistory, I was very much on the spot, on the local level, not only in the local archives. And the question is, what are archives as well? I mean, oral history archives, you might also consider archives. That was one of your other questions. But to dig deeper into what actually happened in the town, and what kind of social processes were there. And there are people on the spot, especially in Tarnów with Adam Bartosz and other people, who are extremely engaged in educating youth. And there was a project from students from Tarnów High School who interviewed their grandparents, asking them what exactly happened during the Shoah in Tarnów, etc. So I think on the local level, we can carve out a lot more through archives, through memoirs, through oral history. And this is not, of course, an answer to your question, but maybe a beginning that local memories can be reshaped by these kind of narratives. I don't think that I had the what if question was so pertinent. The alternative reality was not the one, what would happen if the war didn't break out in 1939? The question was more, was there an alternative to the Ozon-led state in multi-ethnic cities with a very limited scope of action, of course, because cities were still within a voivodeship, within a state, etc. But I think that this was the question of also to compare to other cities where Bunt was a majority, or it was the strongest Jewish group in the city elections, and PPS had the majority in also other towns. So to ask what happened in these towns, was it an alternative to the Ozon-led state? Not an alternative thinking of what would happen if. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for sharpening that that particular point. You're absolutely right that you're really talking more about an alternative at that particular moment in time, as opposed to a counter-historical question. Kamil?
Yes, I will try to give three very short answers to your great questions, Nathan, because I see also great questions in the chat, so I want to reserve our time to answer them. So very shortly, your first question, are the archives really special? What's so special about the archives? Now, what I try to say, there is nothing special in the archives. It is really special if we confront the state-created sources with so-called internal, like sources created by Jewish organizational or individuals outside the state control, which is especially important for communist period, but it's also important for Agnieszka's, for interwar period, of course, also. And let me use one example. If you use the official Zionist sources produced in Poland, that is for state or for official public view by Zionist organization in 1946 and 1947, you can see that they fully supported the communist referendum of 1946 and falsified election in 1947. Now, if you look at the same time, you go to the Israeli archives and you look into internal protocols of the Hashomer Hatzair, Dror, and all other party organizations, you can really see they are very well aware of communist grab of the power, of undemocratic methods that the communists are doing in order to, to fully concentrate power in the state. And they so you have a very different vision when these two sources speak to one another. You have a much more complicated and deeper history. The same about religious life, the same about social life, the same about anti-Jewish violence in Poland. So that's the thing. Just to look very different perspective on the same events, and in this case, inclusion of government sources and of Jewish sources and of different language perspectives just gives you that. And I can go on and on with all the other examples of this kind of conversation of the sources. Your second point about the Polonization and kind of Polonization, Polish nationalism as a kind of theological context. Yes, I do agree with you. And there was some inherent contradiction in all this post-1945 situation. But nevertheless, I just wanted to remind to everybody that Jews who were socialized already in interwar Poland, and which was actually described very neatly by Agnieszka, they're very kind of skillful in moving inside of the Polish nationalism. One another example, great new example, is new book by Natalia Aleksian about the Polish Jewish historians. Meaning that if you look at the Polish Jews in 1945-46, they're very skillful in moving and using Polish nationalism in order to justify their own presence in Lower Silesia. So, of course, it was also undermining the Jewish pluralism, the transnational connections, etc., but it was not able to undermine it fully because this, transnationalism and pluralistic community was really developing until 1949, when all this pluralism was liquidated by the Stalinism. And again, nobody knew in 46, 47, 48 what will happen later. So if you don't want to go into this, kind of unfruitful discussion like in Soviet studies, whether Stalinism was inscribed in the Leninism or particular, decisions in Soviet Union end of 20s and beginning of 30s made the Stalinism what it was, we should do it the same with the Polish Jewish studies after 1945. And there is a value of looking how people fought and looked on the things in 46. There is a value of not judging them from the theological point of view. One last very, very short remark. I would never say that the Polish Jewish life after the Holocaust was vibrant. It wasn't. The Holocaust, yes, we follow these consequences, the overarching, dominating fact. Nevertheless, and I would never deny the importance of post-war anti-Semitism, of communism, authoritarianism, and so on and so on. Just what I wanted to say, they cannot kind of close our eyes on all the other phenomena that I described. These things should simply be studied together. And I'm stopping here because I really want to answer some of the questions that I see in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, we have quite a lot of questions. Let's see. Let's start with two questions for Kamil, which are actually, I think, related to each other. One of them is from Dariusz Stola, who asks if you to elaborate on what you called Zionist and communist teleologies in interpretations of post-1945 history of Polish Jewry. He says, I don't need to be a Zionist or see everything as a consequence of the Holocaust to note the 90% numerical decline of Polish Jewish population from 1946 to 1970. And Natalia Alekshun asks, do you think there's a particular historiographic urge to see the quote-unquote doom of post-Shoah rebuilding efforts in Poland more so than about other Jewries in Europe? Or is it a broader intellectual / emotional tradition? Are those clear?
Clear, but very hard. So, but clear. Yeah. Sadly, they are too clear. Even I cannot avoid them simply.
So maybe we'll start with those. The other question you had actually from two different people was, can you please explain the transition, what you call the transition from nationalism to peoplehood?
Okay, I should start with those, yes, because, okay, and I should stop answering the another that I've seen, yes, but maybe we'll have time. Okay, so again, very shortly, yes, for question of Dariusz Stola, of course, the fact of 90% of Polish Jews killed during the Holocaust, it's the fact. Nevertheless, this 10% was 300,000, that more than 200,000 left. Actually, came to Polish lands for a few months and they were gone after 1946. Nevertheless, there is this 100,000 and there is a big discussion what will happen to them. And of course, for Zionists, they will be taken out of Poland in question of days or even months. There is no other, there is no reason for them to stay. They will leave. That's the official Zionist narration. But what I actually gave in a footnote of my paper, I have an interview with Itzhak Greenbaum given for Morgen Journal in March, if I'm not mistaken, 1948, after his trip to, I don't remember, end of 47 or beginning of 48, after his trip to Poland. And he says that he was terrified meeting these thousands of Jews that they don't want to leave. They will never leave because they are really, they're really progressing with their lives in Poland. And so there is a Zionist teleology that is on the ground denied by the thousands of people who decide to stay from all the reasons that I said. And this is even confirmed by the most diehard Zionists, like Itzhak Greenbaum. Now, there is, of course, this communist teleology of integration, of Jews secularizing, of Jews, internalizing very strongly the communist system and communist ideology, etc., etc. Now the story is very much more complicated. Non-Orthodox, yes, non-Orthodox from a communist point of view, and non-Orthodox from any other, narrations, dominant ideological narrations that we want to put on the ground. So the same as using the example of the great study about Magnitogorsk of Sovietologist Stephen Kotkin, that there is a Stalinism as a civilization, but on a daily ground, the Stalinist culture looks very differently than Stalinist ideology. The same is with with all the changes in daily life, in culture, in daily behavior of Polish Jews. That just it slips out these great narrations that are actually very much indebted in political ideologies of contemporaries, and which simply as historians should be critical towards them. So it's a kind of very short and not a satisfying answer to Dariusz's question. As for question of Natalia, I think it's not even a question. Natalia is making a very important point. that it's not only the question of historiography, it's also question of emotions, our own emotions, and but nevertheless, I would say that there is a disproportion between how we neglect all the unobvious from the standpoint of Holocaust aftermath characteristics of the Jewish life in post-45 Poland, comparing this to the same period in Germany, in France, and in the Soviet Union, as last 20 or 30 years of studies showed. So again, I'm not denying the crucial, overarching, omnipresent impact of the Holocaust. Is the fact until very day, until we are speaking also through the consequences. We are the consequences of what happened during the Second World War. Nevertheless, there are a lot of stories to be told. And I think, for example, Stanisław Krajewski asked the question about post-1968. Again, there is a very interesting story to be told also about post-1968 period that wasn't told so far. Yeah, thanks.
I think what I sense here is that you're trying to offer a correction to the history, and then other people are wondering, how far does the correction need to go, and can it ever be an overcorrection, and so on. Okay, for Agnieszka, we had some questions from Javi Dreyfus about whether there were Jews who came to Tarnów during the war. And I suppose the impact of that on the question of Polish-Jewish relations during the war that you looked at. Anthony Polonsky had a few questions about Tarnów as well. Because of the increasing hostility towards Jews that you mentioned in the schools, was there a movement among Jews to send their children to private schools? And Natalia had a question about power relations in the apartment buildings. Do you have sources about conflicts that begin before the war and then culminate in the context of the occupation? She also asked, how does being neighbors play out when Jews move out of the building into the ghetto?
Yes, thank you. Very complex questions, very little time. So I'll try to be brief. Thank you. I'm following the questions on the chat. So great questions. Thank you so much. And I think I'll try to answer Javi Dreyfus's and Natalia Aleksian's questions together about the apartment houses. In Tarnów, there was no ghetto until June 1942. So basically until the first, so to speak, resettlement action. So for a long time, Jews and non-Jews really lived together as neighbors for a long time, and this, of course, has changed tremendously after the ghetto was closed in 1942, and 40% of the Tarnów Jews were killed during the first resettlement action just in 1 week, and so we have narratives that begin before the war, and then you can retrace them during the war. But these are often narratives of post-war narratives about Polish-Jewish relations. So this is, so to speak, one narrative. Seldom did I find sources where I could sort of cross-read sources from before the war and then go to the war period, except maybe for one case where you saw that a group of people who helped Jews to build a hideout outside of town in a factory, actually, where people worked, where all pupils from this Czacki school that I talked about, and actually nobody knew about it, not even the children that later gave the testimony that people helped them. But because I was studying this school from the pre-war period, I rediscovered the same names. But this was, of course, this was a wonderful finding, but these kind of findings were very rare, that you could actually find sources from interwar period and then Holocaust. only on individual levels. And yes, there were many Jews, especially from Krakow, that came to Tarnów, and there was a big fluctuation in the population of the Tarnów Jews. From what I've found in the memoirs or testimonies, this was a big problem because they had rarely any contacts outside. So that means often they were illegal, so they didn't have a workplace. So everything was much harder for them in terms of getting food, trade, etc., outside the ghetto, and also finding hiding places. But for those who had neighbors and friendships, these neighbors and friendships didn't always turn out as someone who would help or assist them in their way out. And I made a graph of public schools and the number of Jewish children in public schools, and you can see a very clear decline in the mid-1930s, where percentage of Jewish pupils drop from around 20% in the gymnasium. This was not elementary school because I didn't have numbers for that, but from the gymnasium to about 5%. So there was a big decrease of Jewish students in the gymnasium. However, there was only one private Jewish school in Tarnów. I know these were not extensive answers, but I tried to be brief.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate you both being as succinct as possible. We do have a couple more minutes. So there were two questions from Anthony to Kamil about if you could comment on the absence of anti-Jewish violence in Lower Silesia and on the question of intermarriage after 1944. Those seem like questions that you might be able to answer relatively quickly.
Yes, quickly and too briefly, but of course. First, about the anti-Jewish violence, it's a great question. And actually, anti-Jewish violence is not so small as the sources and some of the historians, although the book of Alina Cała on Jewish special commissions on Jewish self-defense already shows that actually the level of anti-Jewish violence in so-called regained territories was much higher than we thought before. So what you can really see in the sources that there is no this, hell and anti-Jewish killings in central Poland, and the heaven Gan Eden in the regained territories. There is anti-Jewish violence. There are killings of the Jews. There are a lot of accusations of ritual murder. In the case that I'm studying, there was even the scenario almost developed as in Kielce, just the group of Jews that were serving in the special commission, the Jewish self-defense, just were able to catch the guy spreading the ritual murder gossips and arrest him with militia very fast. What is different is the level of fear. Now, the level of fear is also very high in Lower Silesia in spring and summer of 1946 after the Kielce pogrom. But feel socially is felt very differently if you live in the community of 8,000 people, like in the town that I'm studying, and it's a half of the population of the town. Jews are half of the population of the town, or in another town, Wałbrzych, they're like also 7,000 strong. It's 30%. There are 1,000 of Jewish miners, special commission. They're really very coherent Jewish spaces. So feeling of, I will not say safety, but the social function and social feeling of fear is very different than in Kielce or in, I don't know, Tomaszów Mazowiecki or Warka or some other town that, was a shtetl or almost a shtetl and now is empty of Jews. So that's the difference. And again, about the conversation of sources. If you look at the Polish official sources of Jewish committees, and what communist rights? We are organized self-defense, everything is safe, perfect, anti-Semitism is dropping down. If you look again to the JDC reports or to the reports of American journalists or Jewish activists from United States, they write about the violence, they write about the level of fear. So again, if the sources speak to one another, you are able to grasp and to have much deeper story also about the anti-Jewish violence. As about the intermarriage, it's a great question. And what I would say that in the first years after the Holocaust, because of the concentration of the Jews in places like Lower Silesia or in Łódź, and social cohesiveness of Jewish community, actually the level of intermarriage is very low. But of course, the situation changes with the migration, with dropping of the social cohesion, and with the time, especially 1950s, when the new generation comes into the adulthood. Now the intermarriage rises very much, and it's kind of closing up to the level of Warsaw and other Polish metropolis. Meaning, Lower Silesia in this and Łódź in these terms are stopping to become special. But again, there is a great research to be done, implied in Antony's question, in both actually questions. There is a lot to be done on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, our time has come to an end, so I'm going to thank both of our panelists for their excellent papers and all of our attendees for very incisive questions, and wish you all a pleasant rest of your conference. Thank you, everyone.